So, Dahlia, obviously, this week, Brett Kavanaugh was sworn in to be the ninth Supreme Court justice, filling Anthony Kennedy's slot. He had a rather auspicious, I guess, celebration or ceremony with Donald Trump at the White House, where he said that it's the job of a Supreme Court justice to be impartial and nonpartisan, and then went on to thank all the Republicans and the one Democrat who voted for him, which I think perhaps maybe Kavanaugh doesn't know the definition of, being apolitical and nonpartisan. That's quite a concern. Before we get to the gist of your argument that we now need to rely on the other 8 justices to temper Brett Kavanaugh, what do you see in a vacuum? When we look at Brett Kavanaugh's track record, what do you see as the biggest implications of him on the court as opposed to Anthony Kennedy?
I mean, it's hard to understate how consequential this would be. I mean, even if you bracket everything that has happened in the last couple of weeks with Dr. Blasey Ford, this will have been the most consequential appointment, of our lifetimes. This is the sort of Nixon era dream come true, where for the first time you will have a rock solid 5-4 conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court. This is going to be, just as a matter of metrics, it will be, some of the most conservative jurists who have been seated in the last 100 years will now all be sitting on this court. It will be the first time we have a court in decades where every single conservative was seated by a Republican president. Every single liberal was seated by a Democrat. So this is the most political and most partisan court we've ever had. And I think under your question is this real question, and it matters, which is this is going to be the first court in our lifetimes without a swing justice, without somebody like Anthony Kennedy, Sandra Day O'Connor before him, Justice Powell before him, who was in play, who at least had the appearance of the capacity to play for either side depending on what came before the court, and that's gone. So we now have, just the simple fact is John Roberts will be the, quote, swing vote. He will be at the center of this court, and with one or two exceptions, notably the Affordable Care Act, where John Roberts defected and voted with the liberal branch of the court, he is a movement conservative. He is a rock-solid vote for the Heritage Foundation, for the Federalist Society values. And so I don't know how to put a finer point on it than this. This is simply the fulfillment of the Ed Meese, Nixon, capture the court dream now materialized in front of our eyes.
And so, major areas, obviously, abortion rights. That doesn't necessarily mean that Roe v. Wade will be overturned, but it does mean that it will be effectively maybe overturned in states that are hostile towards it. So we'll see things like trap laws. The scrutiny applied to what states do in terms of infringing on this right is going to be far less than it used to be when Anthony Kennedy was there. We could see rollbacks on marriage equality rights. But it also seems to me that we're going to see a direct assault, perhaps, on the Chevron doctrine, which basically says that agencies have the expertise in which to promulgate regulations if broadly tasked with that by Congress. We're going to probably see a diminishment on the ability of government to regulate without very, very, very specific directives from Congress.
That's exactly right. I think Brett Kavanaugh is a certain vote for what we've seen as the slow erosion of the regulatory state, a deep suspicion of regulatory agencies on the part of the courts. And I don't think Brett Kavanaugh has made any secret of the fact that he is firmly in the camp that wants to do away with Chevron deference to agencies to set their own rules and agendas. And I think that, in addition to the laundry list you just put forward, I think that some of the other things that are really on the table now, where Anthony Kennedy would have been the decisive fifth vote, are affirmative action in higher education, which is probably now on the chopping block. I think gun regulations is an incredibly important area where, the court weighted it in Heller and then refined it a little bit in McDonald, but has essentially sat silent for years and years while gun regulations more or less won in the lower courts. I think that Kavanaugh's shown a very capacious view of Second Amendment rights, and we're going to see gun laws start to come down. And probably the single most important thing, and again, I don't think Kavanaugh has made any secret of his views on this, are issues around executive power and executive authority, and the kind of what our view of the president's authority, whether it's specifics like can the president be investigated or can he be indicted, or fanciful things like can he pardon himself, or just questions that we're going to see, I think, almost inevitably arise around the Mueller probe. All of those issues, Brett Kavanaugh has a very, very, very broad view of executive power and authority, and so I think he would presumably be a fifth vote for that.
So, and I want to get into this idea of how the other justices, can or will or won't influence Kavanaugh, or vice versa, for that matter. But and I know this is maybe beyond one's ability to predict, but when we look at the Supreme Court adjudicates somewhere around, they hear about 80 cases a year, if I'm not mistaken. They decide maybe another 50 or so. I don't know how many of the last term, when we had Kennedy, we had full complement of justices. How many were 5-4? But are we going to see? And I guess maybe this is a question that speaks to your piece a bit. Are we going to see that much more 5-4s? Was there a certain amount of horse trading that would take place? So are we going to see exponentially more 5-4 decisions than we would have maybe 3 years ago? Because maybe in some instances, a Breyer or a Ginsburg or a Kagan would say, I'm going to vote to make this 6-3 or 7-2, because maybe down the road it will build a relationship with a specific judge in a specific area of the law that I'll be able to swing them onto my side. Is that how it happens in the court? Do we know?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Sam. And I think, there's this famous story that is told that Justice Brennan every year used to ask his clerks, like, what is the single most important constitutional principle of all? And the answer was, get to 5.
Right.
You need 5 votes. That's the only thing that matters. And I've seen some interesting chatter suggesting that, you're certainly right. And particularly in this last term, we saw Elena Kagan and Steve Breyer try to find middle positions in a whole bunch of cases that looked like they were, whether it's explicitly horse trading or cultivating relationships or playing some kind of long game, trying to get Anthony Kennedy to peel off and clump with them. And we saw that in a few instances. I've seen some interesting theorizing that says, good, now they're freed up. They can become, full-throated liberal dissenters they were born to be, and they don't have to try to play this game of getting to 5. Now, I don't know that that's the case. I think sort of by temperament, both Breyer and Kagan tend to be moderates who try to hive off narrow things and decide as little as possible. Certainly, Elena Kagan has said in the last few weeks that her view of the court and these legitimacy questions around the court in this polarized moment is that it really turns on the Chief Justice, on John Roberts, to do minimalist, centrist, very narrow, very cabined decisions so as to more or less stay out of the headlines.
right.
And it's almost like she threw down the gauntlet and said, John Roberts, you've done this before when we had a 4-4 court and everybody was watching. You know how to do this, and you're going to have to do it again.
That's fascinating. All right, well, let's take a quick break. I'll be right back with Dahlia Lithwick on the implications of Brett Kavanaugh being sworn in as the 9th Justice on the Supreme Court. Be right back on Ring of Fire Radio.